the one who wins is the one who defines the market.
Like, is it something you like to talk about doing, but don't always use it in your day-to-day tasks, or is it something that you like stand by?
Yeah, I mean, that is the fundamental question for anybody that gives these talks, right? Nobody wants to lose the feature that they're waiting for GDPR. Single user needs sometimes can outweigh even a larger percentage of users because of the context of the deal. Was for the first time in my life, I actually had users.
All right, everyone. Hello, hello. How's everybody doing today? Hopefully, you're all doing well. Welcome to today's webinar session. We're calling it How Understanding User Needs Can Make or Break Your Product with Dan Leitão. If we haven't met before, or this is your first time tuning into one of our webinars, hello. My name is Maciek, and I am the Digital Customer Success Manager here at Cervicate. But for today, I'll be your host for this little webinar interview we got planned for you. Okay, so today's rundown is quite simple. I love it when the rundown is this simple. If the title didn't spoil it, we've got a very special guest, and that, of course, is Dan. He's Chief Product Officer at SkootEco and StickyVentures, and he will be walking us through all of the wonderful real world lessons and adventures he's had on understanding user needs, and of course how that plays into developing products, your beloved products, and of course the Q&A afterwards. So don't forget to write in your questions at any time. All right. uh I've built it enough, right? The suspense is here. Dan, welcome. Thank you for being here today with me. It is truly a pleasure. How's your day? How's everything?
Yeah, my day's going really well. Really happy to be here. Thanks again, Maciek and Cervicate, for asking me to do this. And, just excited to spend some more time with you.
Awesome. Awesome. So, yeah, let's get right into it. Today, as you know, we're talking about understanding user needs, right? We all know that understanding what our users need is the crucial key to building products people love. I'm curious to find out from you today how big of a role understanding user needs plays in your life as a CPO. So, with that, can you please about your role in general and your experiences with user feedback?
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, understanding user needs has always been foundational to every product role I've worked in. From when I was a product manager working on the first mobile app at my friend's startup, all the way to today at both Scoot and StickyVentures. I think the really interesting thing is for anybody in product, it's just about understanding the problem, finding the needs, and building the right solutions. For me at Scoot on a daily basis, that is helping businesses find little small ways that they can do something positive for the planet. And at Sticky
Yeah.
Ventures, it's helping founders take their idea from 0 to 1 and kind of really finding what is the right fit for their product and their business. So
Mhm.
when I think about creating great products, I always go back to this foundational kind of quote, which is you have to fall in love with the problem, not the solution. And
All
if
right.
I reflect on my career, there have definitely been times when I've been obsessed with the solution. And I think that we've kind of cracked it. And that's because maybe I like the technology we're working with. Maybe it's a cool new experience that we're building. And so I always have to remind myself that when building product, it's there to solve a problem. And that's because foundationally, creating great products solves problems simply. And sometimes technology is the best way to do that, and other times it's not. And it's kind of essential when identifying needs to understand where those needs come from and kind of what the problems they are solving or addressing. And
Hmm.
so if you're a new product manager or a seasoned one, and people start to talk about what are the ways that you identify user needs, the phrase that I kind of use is, well, what's the discourse on the product? And so have we done data analysis? Have we done interviews, surveys? Have we looked at competitors? What are we observing, either how people use it or in the market? User testing, both moderated and unmoderated, reviews, kind of support tickets, and actually experiencing the product, which a lot of people like to call dog fooding.
Dog fooding. Okay. I know some people call it fish fooding. Have you ever heard of that?
I've never heard of fish fooding, to be
Are you
honest.
serious? I feel
Yeah,
like okay. I guess there's like all right. Like there's iPhone, there's Android, and there's dog fooding and fish fooding. All right, never mind. So there's different angles here. I'm seeing them. It's all cool. Since you got a nice list here, out of those standard approaches, right? Maybe you have a favorite one you use.
yeah. I mean, I think for me, kind of observation is one that I always like to think about. If you ride in an Uber with me, you'll see that I spend most of the time watching how the driver is using their phone.
Okay.
If I'm in public, I like to watch how people use their phones. I think if you're building mobile apps, just immersing yourself in how people solve other problems and other solutions, where you see the gaps are, is always a fun one. Dog fooding, since we were talking about it, is something that I really like. I think though, what I've often found is not only dog fooding your own product and kind of trying and testing it, but using competitors. Uh,
Mm,
that being said, nothing really beats having actual users in their real location. And we'll talk about this a bit later, kind of
yeah.
getting to using it. But last, because we're here and I'm talking to you, I think surveys are always a brilliant way to do it, especially when you think
Surveys.
you sure.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Obviously I'm biased, right? I'm a big fan of using survey approach, right? Obviously, they're ultra scalable, right? Potential
Exactly.
for capturing both quantitative and qualitative insights makes them irreplaceable. Uh, for informing product development and ensuring that how do I say this? The product meets user expectations, right? So I'm glad you mentioned that.
Yeah, no, surveys are key. We often do surveys, kind of more 0 to 1 things before we've
Yeah.
even built the product. And then once we've built the product, I like to have them once you release a new feature and really try to get that, especially when you're dealing with users at scale.
Hmm.
So,
Wonderful.
kind of moving on from the standards, I think going back to how you kind of identify what the core problem and the needs of the user you're solving is kind of where I like to use a methodology that I call pen, paper, and people. So
Okay.
I will ask myself when I'm dealing with a problem, and this can be a brand new idea or it can be a feature set in our existing tool. How do people solve this without technology? How do they solve it with pen and paper? At Photobox, when I worked there, uh, we were helping people make photo books with AI. And so that's a really easy way to look at the pen and paper because people make photo books in the real world without technology. They cut up photos, they do things. And as a result of having that kind of physical experience where they know the way that process works, they have an
Yeah.
expectation for what they can do in the app. And so one of the most interesting things is the needs from building a photo book on a computer when you think about it versus the needs of being able to do that on an actual physical product. There's a lot of differences, and so people's expectations are kind of crafted because they've experienced it physically before, and so they want the digital to be as close to that as possible. Kind of the opposite side of that was at Onfido. So in Onfido, we were charged with identifying people's identity remotely. So when people
Uh-huh.
wanted to be able to authenticate who they were, either to open bank accounts, to get jobs, to be able to trade crypto, whatever it was, there's regulations and there's different reasons why you want to know who your customer is. And so Onfido looked to solve that through automating the process of identifying people. And I specifically looked at over the identity documents. If you think about the process of going to a bank to verify who you are, there's a lot of pain there as a user. You see that you have to leave your house, go to the bank, produce the document. And from the business sides, the person that's looking at that document may not be trained properly to even know if that document's authenticated. So there's a lot of
Good
pain
point.
points there. And you can kind of look to see how you would solve it in a very different way. So the opposite to Photobox, the user needs were not to match the physical experience. The user needs were to give them something completely different that was better and much less painful.
Okay. So that's very interesting. It's a very like philosophical approach. I like it. But like, how often do you actually use this technique? Meaning, like, is it something you, you know, you like to talk about doing, but don't always use it in your day-to-day tasks, or is it something that you like stand by?
Yeah, I mean, that is the fundamental question for anybody that gives these talks, right? Is it just
Mhm.
something that sounds good in sound bites or not? So for
Exactly.
me, in my day-to-day, I think there's a lot of opportunities where I do break it down to pen and paper. And actually, as a skill, if you start to do this, you start to be able to do it a lot faster. When we have ideas, especially kind of concept ideas, absolutely. With features, it gets a lot more interesting, a lot more complex, because generally when you're building a feature, somebody's already working in your system. So part of what they do on a daily basis now is you use your tool. So to say, well, would they solve this with pen and paper? The answer may be, well, they don't have all the data that we're giving them. So they can't do it
Right.
that way. And so then it's really about looking at what that process is like, either without your tool, or how that kind of problem gets solved currently. And so you can look at the current way that they solve it as, if we don't build anything, what are they doing and how are we doing it?
Well
Um,
said. Well said.
so I think where you kind of go from that is
Yeah.
into the question of, is your solution creating problems?
Mm-hmm.
So as you build technology around the tool, kind of exactly like we were just talking about, you can actually find out that you're generating new needs for your customers based on what you're giving them. And those can be positive needs or negative needs. So at Vinaya, we allowed people to disconnect from technology. We created a wearable where they could get alerts that were only very specific to them, and it was jewelry based. But of course, the second that they were wearing something, what we found is people said, I'm have this wearable. It is a wearable. It is technology that's connected. So what I
Mm-hmm.
want to be able to do is I want to be able to get more information from it. Even though the entire reason I started with this product is less technology, the question kept arising, can you tell me the step count that I have? Can you tell me this? And so those needs that had never existed for those people, because these were users that had identified they would never wear standard wearable technology. Their needs were set by the market. And so as we look to expand the product, they actually wanted us to get much closer to that kind of standard wearable technology. And so when we were looking at this, those people had never had those needs before because they'd
Mm-hmm.
never felt they needed them. And so sometimes that's a positive kind of issue. There's lots of other times where you build a feature and now you create a new backlog and a new part of the process. It's great for a business because you can generate new features to solve those problems, but how can you reduce those? And so it's really about identifying what the needs of the business are on a wider scale than kind of that one feature you're looking at.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense there. Maybe you have like an example of this?
So I think, kind of going back to this point of, is your solution creating problems? When I look at user needs and start to kind of categorize them in the backlog, in the idea screening process, especially once a product has already gotten to market, I always look at identifying, is this a need that has originated from day one, or is it a need that's arising that's trying to solve something that we're creating? Because you have the opportunity then to go back and track and say, is there something fundamentally in the feature that we released that we can change to do this? Of course, this gets into that kind of concept of, how do I balance all these needs that are coming into my product? And so for me, I think in product management generally, there's kind of a false tension between business and user needs.
Mm-hmm.
Your
Mm-hmm.
product exists because of the business. You can't solve user needs if your business stops existing. So at a B2B company, if you're not enabling sales, you aren't doing your job. And at a B2C company, if you aren't enabling growth, you aren't doing your job. And I think that's foundational to how product managers should be. There's a lot of debates about what is the role of a product person in an organization. Are they
Mm-hmm.
more business? Are they more technical? Are they focused on this part or that part? Are they responsible for the delivery of the tech team? Are they responsible for the P&L? And this changes with the type of business in the organization. But as long as
Definitely.
a product person remembers that their product exists because of the business, when they get business needs that come up, and those business needs can be something simple that the business needs a type of reporting. It can be more complex, like regulatory requirements. When I was at Onfido, GDPR was coming in. So it was a business need, but it wasn't something that any of our customers needed or they
Mm-hmm.
felt they needed. Of course, they did. The customers needed us to be compliant with GDPR, but nobody wants to lose the feature that they're waiting for GDPR. And another kind of example from Onfido is when we were building products, the business needs us to close clients. And sometimes those clients had specific requests that were askew from the product vision or anything like that. But the decision that I always wanted to enable the team, especially in documents, was that if we could find a way to solve that, closing that business was as important as delivering a feature that I aspirationally wanted us to deliver.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So correct me if I'm wrong. Understanding user needs obviously is crucial, right, for product growth. But how do you create? What's the question I want to? How do you create like a unique industry defining product if you are only focused on unlocking growth? You know what I mean?
I completely. It's a great question. And I think there's a few ways you can look at that. So the easy way is uh, the products that define industries are generally the businesses that are successful. So
Mm-hmm.
I often used to say, for me, and I've not attained this success in my product career thus far, I want really to be able to have a product that I build become the name that people use for that product. So think Kleenex, right? If you're from the US, Kleenex means tissue. Now, of course, that's mainly marketing. That has very little to do with your product. There's loads of tissues that solve that. But when it comes to digital tech products, there's definitely the one who wins is the one who defines the market and they define the experience. And
Well
so
said.
I think you have to be able to, and that's why I think that tension between business and user needs is something that product people like to talk about a lot. But if they actually step back and look at it, they're all serving the same goal, which is the business building the product is successful.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. And how can I somehow maybe, I don't want to leave it hanging like that. Was there anything else maybe that you found challenging, right, about the transition?
Yeah. So moving from being a kind of product person at a small startup focused on 0 to 1, working with multiple startups to moving to scale ups is,
Yeah.
really kind of like Dorothy. You're not in Kansas anymore. Um, the first time you make that transition, it's difficult. And, for me, one of the biggest differences from moving from companies like Muddler, Cometa, and Vinaya to companies like Photobox and Onfido was for the first time in my life, I actually had users of significance.
Mm-hmm.
It was always a challenge when you're in a startup. You start growing, you start getting users, but to be statistically significant in all this, you're not able to be able to reach those numbers. Maybe on a good day you are, but on bad days you're not. And so that transition of being a product manager who was always trying to have to infer a lot of user needs to being a product manager that has enough data to be able to see things. I send out a survey, I'm not getting just 10 responses. That's
Yeah.
transformative for a product role. That also means that prioritizing the time for visibility and kind of tracking of features versus building new features shifts because you're able to have a much better understanding of how people are using those features and everything. And sure, we can say at a startup, you want to build that from day one, but you'll always focus on kind of the feature.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Uh, you know what? You've been talking about them a lot throughout this webinar, so I'd love to maybe hear a little bit more about your on-Fido experience, right? Were there any other lessons you learned along the way, maybe, right? I'd love to hear about it. I'm sure everyone else would as well.
Yeah, so I think transitioning at Onfido, probably one of the biggest challenges I had as the company grew successfully was I was so used to being responsible for tasks that I'd previously owned. And so I was in a position where everything fell on me. And then all of a sudden I had people at my disposal that I could utilize for jobs that I had always been the realm of just a product person. Whether that was product design, wanting to be much more involved in the solutioning, whether that was getting data analysis done for you, those things change and they mean you need to prioritize your time differently. I think the other thing for me was really dealing with this kind of idea of, do I want to be a scientific minded product manager, or can I do what I've always done in startups? So, being overly scientific in product management can lead to analysis paralysis. Sometimes you just need to take a leap of faith, according to an unknown product manager that was trapped inside ChatGPT when I was writing this. And I think for me, that as I moved to companies like Onfido and Photobox, having those resources presented their own challenges. So I had never been in a position where I was not the one doing the user interviews. It had all, now I had a UX research team. And so with the UX research team, they want to go off and they want to be statistically significant. They want to ask unbiased questions. And I was in a different room watching these, and I wanted to get the answers to the questions I would have always asked. And so part of that was an educational experience. And part of that was talking to the UX researchers and saying, look, there's some key questions. You're just getting to the thing and we need to follow up. And we need a way that we can follow up here, even though you have a script and a practice that you want to follow. And so I think, that was one of the experiences. Also, the idea of being data-driven. So really being in a position to make data-driven decisions on your product. When I went to Photobox, we had a very data-driven organization. Whether or not there was a search bar on the menu for an e-commerce company selling photo products was A/B tested. Whether or not we had this or that was A/B tested. I was put in charge of the AI for creating photo books for people. And because Photobox is a business that is peaky, certain periods it's busy and other periods it's not. Leading up to Christmas, very busy. Middle of July, when you've developed a new feature and you need to make decisions, not so peaky. If you're making small changes that aren't very large in a statistical significance way, it's very difficult to get that data. And so you had to be able to say, we're getting user needs from other places, and go to a business that wants to be data driven and say, look, I know how we operate in this part of the business, but here we need to emphasize much more user interviews. We need to emphasize much more competitive analysis and testing and all these things so that we can make a decision to be ready in time for our busy period. And so that meant shifting really in the business what had been a very data-driven approach into something that in that one instance, they allowed kind of that more gut and basis that was not purely from, kind of data analysis.
Wow, a lot of information to unpack that I wish we had 3 hours. We don't.
So to dive in a bit more to what you were asking about, Maciek, with Onfido, when I was at Onfido, I had the opportunity to be like Carl Hanratty from Catch Me If You Can. So my job was to build technology that would stop fraudsters from being able to verify their identity within the document check. And so part of this was done purely from the document check, and another part was done by a wonderful biometrics team that looked at kind of facial recording and everything like that. But from my side, it was all about your identity documents. And our job was to build this so that we could do it in under a decreasing amount of seconds. So it started where there was a much longer time, and the goal was to get it under 15 seconds, under 5 seconds, and kind of reach those automation goals. And so part of this was about how do we detect the fraud, and the other part was how do we give those results to people. And I talked about this a bit earlier, which is sometimes you have to build a feature for a problem that you created. And so we had a very large financial company that was interested in the results we were giving them. But as a result of the way we returned the results, they were not strong enough for them to make the decisions they needed to do, while they were for
Yeah.
most other people. And so this was creating a big manual backlog for them and everything. And the result here, crafted in a sales meeting, kind of following that principle of how do we solve these problems simply, was to return something that was a kind of sub results. And that was a decision that was made to secure a client. We used it to kind of convince a few other clients. But as a result of that, that architecture still exists today. And from my friends that are still there, sometimes they find it annoying to this day that that
Mm-hmm.
functionality was there. But we identified, and from my perspective, we had a need that was an end user who needed to be able to make decisions quickly on what they were going to do with users. And our technology wasn't strong enough for them at the time. And that meant a kind of short decision. How do we do this quickly? We had some data, we could expose that data, we make a patch, we release it. And that user was happy. But as a result of that, all following users found those
Mm-hmm.
results annoying, confusing. And over time, you can do things to change those. But the focus there, and from my perspective, was the business needs to continue, and winning that business was more important. So those single user needs sometimes can outweigh even a larger percentage of users because of the context of the deal. And
Mm-hmm.
so, we created that problem in the way we returned the results initially, and we had to solve it, even if it became a kind of pain point. I think another kind of thing when scaling at Onfido that was super interesting to me is really learning to value internal tools, because
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
they have users too, and they're often forgotten. And on Vito, we had a unique opportunity where we kind of had different types of internal users, and when the fraud checks failed, we needed to have people looking into that data and kind of making decisions to train and support the UI. And those users were not located in our office; they were located around the globe, and that actually meant that the company made a decision to send the design team to those locations so they could observe the workers in their location. You know, there's a lot to be said about unmoderated user testing done remotely or done in a lab. But one of the most interesting things is seeing people do it in the context. At
Mm-hmm.
Photobox, it's one thing to have somebody come in and want to do user testing on in a lab when they're a mom and they want to make a photo book. But if one thing we realized during COVID when we started doing remote user testing is actually you got to understand the user situation a lot more. That was a young mother who wanted to make a photo book of their child. Those
Okay.
were her needs, but it also needed to be done while parenting. Whereas when somebody comes into the lab, you're in a situation where they're not having to parent at that time. And so
Mm-hmm.
their cognitive load, their needs are different. It was the same for the people that were supporting when these document checks failed. And so when you got into the situation, you could understand exactly how it was. Our thinking that had been removed from where we were and how we wanted to solve it, we realized was completely wrong, because the needs of being in the situation where these people were checking was drastically different from the needs we had imagined. And so we had to rebuild and kind of reskin that tool. And the team did an amazing job at that. And Onfido was able to scale to the size they were able to scale because of making decisions that valued often forgotten needs. Generally speaking, internal tools are, yes, you have users, but people don't want to think about those users. They think that's where you can save costs, where you don't need to put design. I'm sure that there may be an internal tool that you use that you wish got a bit more love, and most people probably do. And that's
Mm-hmm.
because
Mm-hmm.
they don't get the value they should. But actually, those users can be as important as your end users, because they help serve your end users so much better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, lots of wonderful stuff there. We got an awesome overview so far. What would you say are like maybe the general takeaways there?
Yeah, so I think a few things for me, you know, some tools that I use around user needs are very kind of classic. The pains and gains map. It's a circle with some areas, and you can map the pains and gains that people have around the needs that they're experiencing. The other one that I always like when dealing with product is looking at the Kano model. So this is the idea of being able to understand, what is a delighter, what's a table stake, and what's just a baseline, and kind of where do your features fall within this map. And I've always found that actually probably more effective as I've moved up in product leadership, when I have to gain insights from other kind of key stakeholders, that the map is a way to make a roadmap seem a lot more understandable, and kind of why you're valuing certain things. And obviously you can, underneath that, have all the support and data you have, but that visualization is really easy. And then concepts, I mean, for me, I think there's a few things that I have said today, but focusing on the problem, and it's a fundamental user need. Needs are needs. Business needs are not the enemy, although oftentimes they feel like it. And depending on the stage of the business and kind of where you're at, and even the feature you're developing, understanding how you can balance those kind of scientific user needs that are quantifiable and really easy to understand, and then the gut ones where you just know that there's something that's not right, and find a way to get the data to support that. And we kind of covered all the ways you can do that through that kind of discourse. So just remember discourse around your product and you'll be good.
Discourse, discourse, discourse. You mentioned the last part, balancing scientific and gut often depends. Okay, but also I would include there's something you mentioned earlier. Sometimes you just need to take a leap of faith.
Absolutely.
All right, awesome stuff, Dan. My head is melting from all these wonderful insights you've been putting out. And I'm sure the people have been eagerly waiting to ask some questions. So, how about we get to those? What do you say?
Sounds great. Let's do it.
Awesome. So, let me just transition here. How about we start with the written in questions, right? I know that there were a couple. I have even prepared some slides for that. So let me just get that up and running here. And let's see what we got. Of course, we'll go over these and then we'll go to the chat. We have a couple questions there. So here is the first question. What methods of researching and analyzing user needs have proven most effective in your experience, particularly in the context of creating and developing products? Thank you, Adrian, for that question. Dan, what do you think?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's a kind of horses for courses when it comes to this. A lot depends on the stage, I think, of the company and kind of the product. But I will always go to user interviews and user testing, especially unmoderated when you can do it, on as real of a product as possible. Being able to see people using it is really important. I think also the ability to, as you get to scale, to look at more data-driven approaches. So I think A/B tests are always valid, but for me, and I'll go back to it because I know I talked about it earlier, I would say surveys still, and I'm not just saying that because I'm talking to you, especially when we start with new products, being able to survey people on the investigating kind of questions, that's always really valuable. And then as we release features, having surveys come out kind of after a feature is released.
There we go. Yeah, I'm happy you mentioned it. So shameless plug time. I have to do it because we're speaking about it, right? Yeah, basically, I wanted to invite all of you, to everybody who attended today, everybody who's watching maybe later, to give Cervicate a try. If you're looking to collect targeted user feedback using different channels, right? This means mobile, website, email. It'll go a long way in helping you and your product team understand user needs, preferences, right? Ultimately helping you streamline product growth, right? Feature improvements, user experience enhancements, and all those wonderful things. We have an awesome 10-day free trial that lets you try all that stuff out. So yeah, Anastasia will probably drop a link in the chat there. End of the shameless plug. Let's keep going. Thank you, Adrian, once again for the wonderful question. And the last question, which was written in, is what's one thing you would have done differently when you started Muddler? Am I pronouncing that right?
Yeah, Muddler was the first app that I ever worked on. My friend was the founder of that company. I started being a product manager, not even knowing what that title meant at the time. So I think probably one thing is I would have learned more about the role that I was filling, since I didn't actually really understand it. But from a product perspective, we released that, and this will show my age, when Foursquare was the most popular app kind of out. And instead of checking into the location, we actually had you check into the drink you were drinking, and we were using it to collect drink prices and ratings across cities. And oddly, the feature that we found most impactful for users was still the ability to see where their friends were out and drinking, and so they could go meet up in New York City. And so probably would have lent more into the location-based side of that product than we kind of originally saw, because we found out the needs of the users were much more about finding out where their friends were.
All right. Very interesting story there. Thank you. And thank you. Who wrote this in? I believe it was Mark. So thank you for doing that. Okay, so let's get into the chat here. I believe we have, yeah, nice. Good work, everybody. We have 3 questions, maybe 4 even. Nice. Okay, so let's go with the first one. And it is, this comes from Brian. Thank you, Brian. What is something you would recommend to a product manager at a business that it feels isn't addressing the user needs and instead pushing new features that don't solve the needs customer support is seeing?
Yeah, it's something I'm familiar with and I've experienced before. Sometimes you have either clients wanting certain features and you have to focus on those, or quite often there's a aspirational goal. So the first thing is finding a better way to quantify what customer support is seeing if you can tie that to churn of existing customers. Talk about the fact that winning new customers is always more difficult than kind of keeping the customers you have. I think the other thing, and I do this a lot with products, is I create a list of things that we want to hit when we go into certain areas of that product. So if you have a dashboard homepage, let's say, and customer support is complaining about these 3 things, and that's what they're seeing, take 1 or 2 of those things, and the next time you release a new feature and you have to update the dashboard, you just put those features in as well. And you say, we're going to hit this. And you kind of talk to leadership and say, we're opening the code base already, so we might as well do this because it's going to be better to update it at once. So trying to combine those needs into those new features whenever possible, because it just saves time and lets you kind of get multiple things done at once.
Yeah, well said. Thank you, Brian. And we'll head on to the next one from Mason, which is, can you tell us more about the pivot at Scoot?
Yeah, so when I joined Scoot, it was a ride sharing company. So it was focused on creating a ride sharing network from your personal network. So you could get rides fairly and pay your friends back for rides they gave you, but also use your network so you could feel safe with who you were riding with. And at its kind of outset, it wanted to make sure that those rides were sustainable. So it started by just planting trees during rides. And from there, as that happened though during the pandemic, not the ideal time to launch a ride sharing company, but we started talking to businesses about carpooling. And this is a lesson on listening to user needs and being able to react as a business. The businesses we were talking about said carpooling sounds like a great way to reduce the footprint, but we don't even know what the footprint is of our business. And so we need help with that. And so we slowly started pivoting the company to focus on the needs of the businesses we were talking to. and eventually even sunset the ride sharing component of the business, because we saw that there were a lot of needs and kind of problems we could address for businesses that wanted to do sustainability right. So yeah, we kind of took it from a small grain that existed in the original product, or should I say seed, that started in the original product, and kind of transitioned it to help businesses today. And it's a great story of a startup's ability to be resilient and, listening to what the needs of your customers were.
Well done. Thank you, Mason, for this question. Let's see, we have any more? Okay, we do. We have one from Oleg here, and it goes like this. What is something fundamental about product development that you changed your mind on in recent years?
Yeah, so it's a good question, making me think. Thanks, Oleg, for that. I would say probably one of the biggest things that I've changed my mind on is whether or not the product management team needs to be responsible for delivery of the tech product. I think in certain organizations, especially when you're the single product person at a 0 to 1 company, you end up being responsible for it. But I think there's a lot of interesting conversations going on now about product managers not needing to be responsible for the output of the development team, and looking at different ways that you can staff teams around that. So it's something that I've started to change my mind on, but I've not had the ability to practice it enough to really speak to its value. But I think I've started to change that, and I think it's a pretty fundamental thing of product development as people see it in the role of the product manager.
Good one. Okay, I was going to say last question, but there was another question. Awesome. We're on fire today. Let's do this one from, I'm going to say it wrong, but it says RUPS. And the question is, have you had to override A/B testing results? If yes, how did it go?
I have had to override A/B testing results, probably 2 different types of situations. So the first is when the A/B test results are inconclusive and you need to make a decision on it, which is kind of more just you don't have enough data, so you have to go with one. But I have had to override an A/B test that we did once around a feature, and the feature was for a startup that no longer exists. So I'm not sure, but how it went, because the company no longer exists. So if you take that as a answer, but if we look at the microcosm of the feature was essentially initially set up as a false door, and then we released the feature. And when we released the feature, we were A/B testing it, kind of splitting who saw it and who didn't see it around the onboarding journey. And the results were negative from the A/B test in terms of the metrics of conversion, but the feedback was positive from everybody that was doing it. And the reason was they had a much better understanding of the product. And so if we looked at the conversion data, it was wrong. If we looked at the retention data, probably after we made the call, it was higher, but we had less people coming through the door. So I think it was the right decision, but we took qualitative responses and overrode the kind of quantitative A/B testing.
Okay, that's interesting indeed. Thank you for this question. And the last question we have to kind of close all this together, and it's a interesting one. I wonder what you're going to say here. The question comes from Kevin, and it is, who do you follow as a thought leader on product?
That's a great question. I think there's a few people, and I'm going to probably say one that is more popular, and then a few that are people I've actually worked with that kind of are in the product thought leader space, and I think they do a brilliant job. So the kind of first person that I talk about is John Cutler. He was originally at Amplitude. He has a great Substack about product. He's a great Twitter follow. Him and I have engaged on Twitter before. I think he's really thoughtful on product. And one other, which is kind of counter to a lot of product things you read out there, are the guys behind Basecamp. So Jason Fried and DHH. I think their approach is very different from a lot of what you read around product and how to build startups. And I think that that's really brilliant. And then Susanna Lopez and Zhao Kravi are two product managers that I worked with on Fido, who talk and frequently at events and kind of post those talks, and they're active on LinkedIn. And I think they're excellent follows because I know how they work, and their careers have continued to go really well, and they have really useful insights on product.
All right. And that will bring us to the finish line, Dan. Thank you to everyone for your questions. Awesome questions. Thank you, Dan, for being such a wonderful speaker. It was truly an honor to sit down with you, hear about all your interesting experiences, and most of all, thank you for the insights that you've provided with us today. Everyone, give it up for Dan. You can clap at home, maybe send an emoji, whatever. You can. Oh, there we go. We got some claps in the chat. Okay, there's a lot of claps. Can you feel it, Dan?
I can. I feel it.
Good. If you enjoyed this webinar, there will be plenty more of where that came from. And if you'd like to check out our previous webinars or whatever, just check out our website. We got a whole webinar directory there. Thank you, everyone, once again. Thank you, Anastasia, for being awesome on the chat support there. And thank you, Dan, once again. Yeah.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a real pleasure. I really enjoyed it.
And yeah, see you, everyone. See you at the next one. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.